I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest is Thomas Geoghegan. He has a very interesting piece in the latest issue of Harper's Magazine. It's called Infinite Debt, How Unlimited Interest Rates Destroyed the Economy. Tom Geoghegan, you talk about how with no law capping interest, the evil is not only that banks prey on the poor, they've always done so, but that capital gushes out of manufacturing into banking. When banks get 25% to 30% on credit cards and 500 or more % on payday loans, capital flees from honest pursuits like auto manufacturing. Now, I've just come back from Grand Rapids this weekend and going through Detroit. They're in dire situation, talking about money fleeing from the auto industry.
Sure. I feel one of the reasons I am in favor of the bailout of the auto industry is, aside from all the other reasons, a sense of guilt that we set up all the returns in this economy in favor of financial firms and really disinvested from industry. And even worse, we began to turn industry into banking itself. General Motors, General Electric began to operate banks because that's where they made the big profit in the loans to consumers, uncapped interest. It's a very destructive situation. And this isn't some left-wing progressive critique circa 2009. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations warned how important it is to have interest rate caps on the financial sector or all the money will gush into there and out of productive uses. Keynes in The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, the great classic, 1936, has a little chapter at the end saying, yes, we have deficit spending. I've got this way of getting out of the Depression. By the way, we've got to keep the interest rate caps on the banks. Well, we took that stuff off. The thing that was kind of an instinct in human and legal civilization from the time of the Code of Hammurabi up to the present. And we created all these incentives for money to go into speculation, derivatives, because we addicted the economy to very, very high rates of return by squeezing money out of people. And the way in which we disinvested from the economy was, in my view, not so much globalization or trade as the fact that we had preteens in shopping malls who were running up, debts where they were paying 25, 30% interest when investors could only get 5, 4, 3% from our globally competitive industry.
In your history of usury, basically, from ancient times to today, you're also giving a labor history of this country.
Sure.
Explain.
Well, history, historians like Niall Ferguson, conservative historians and progressive historians, many economic historians see history as nothing but a turf war between three groups: the manufacturers, workers, and the bondholders, or the financial sector. So where does labor fit in all of this? People lost the ability to get wage increases and got the ability, an incredible ability, really unknown in previous times, to get credit cards at which they had high rates of interest. So unable to get wage increases, people, or unable to get union cards, really, people got credit cards and began running up these great debts, which addicted the country to high rates of return in the financial sector, so that people were kind of spending their way out of the real economy, pushing more and more money by the fact that they were going into debt into this virtual financial sector economy. So really the inability of people to raise their own wages and the incredible ease with which they could get credit instead helped create this flow of capital out of manufacturing and into finance. You know, we, the little people in this country, helped finance the bloating up of these financial sector and really the downsizing of our own jobs in the real economy. We sent the signals, to investors to put money into the financial sector and not into the manufacturing sector.
You say U.S. workers increased their productivity over the past 35 years, but real wages actually decreased.
Yes. Well, certainly if you look at the amount of money that went into actual wage as opposed to non-wage labor costs, one of the tragedies of working people in this country is that we don't have single payer. So what some of the
Explain what you mean by that.
If private employers were not paying the health care costs to the private sector, the private insurance industry. A lot of that money could go for wage increases. It also could make the country much more globally competitive. You know, in this congressional campaign that I just finished, I argued for an increase in Social Security, single payer, basically for the government taking over non-wage labor costs so that the globally competitive parts of the economy could lower their labor costs, hire more employees, people could actually get pay raises, and the government would be assuming these non-wage labor costs, which are so important to making the country globally competitive. It's what many of our high-wage rivals are able to do, and they run trade surpluses. We run trade deficits.
You were running for Rahm Emanuel's open seat, so why didn't this idea fly?
Well, I only had 2 months to argue it, and it took me about 1 month to raise enough money to get the message out to voters. And also, Amy, it's very hard to go door to door and explain things to people, which is the key, when it's 30 below wind chill. But next time, I'm going to start in the summer. And if I attempt any run for any office again.
Well, as the economy grew and Wall Street was just blooming, individual workers were, as you write it, individual people were actually becoming worse off.
Sure. Well, they went from being creditors to debtors. That's what was so insidious about this whole process. Not only were people being denied wage increases, but they were losing their, quote, savings, at least in the sense losing the kind of security that they used to have. I saw that as a labor lawyer in Chapter 11 reorganizations, seeing all these companies now taken over by financiers and squeezed for as much profit as they can, go belly up after outsourcing occurred. And then people would be brought into court as creditors, not named as parties, but because they had claims to retiree health insurance and so forth, and would just be stripped of these rights. So, you know, in addition to people not having the wage increases that they needed because of lack of unionization, because of really the fact that the healthcare system was devouring up the money that would have been there to pay for them, they were also losing their savings, and worse than that, losing the sense that if they entered contracts with their employers, the money would be there at the end of the day. So you had this destruction of future-oriented thinking just at the time that the credit cards were being handed out to them, and it was kind of live for the moment.
Explain this issue of people who are getting their health care from the company, pension, retirement, and today we hear on the issue of bonuses, you can't break contracts. But what happens to all of this? For example, when a company decides to, well, just declare bankruptcy.
Well, they aren't really bankrupt. That's the first thing. It's just that these firms set up subsidiary corporations that go into Chapter 11 and get, quote, reorganized. It's very easy to shed unsecured obligations. And virtually all uninsured, non-insured PBGC pension obligations and all health care obligations and other supplemental benefits that people earn over a lifetime are completely unsecured and are the first thing to go in a reorganization. So over the 1980s, 1990s, and if any were left by the early 21st century, the 01s, people would be dragged into court as creditors and emerge as debtors. And the debtors, that is the big companies, would walk away with enormous savings. And these companies were really just subsidiaries often of firms that were really quite well off. But they used the device of subsidiary incorporation. They used the ease of going in and then out of Chapter 11, or just liquidating these subsidiary corporations and starting over with a different framework to shed all these obligations. Or they just went out of business altogether and put the money into speculative financial sector type things, which were supposedly going to bring huge returns.
When, Thomas
the kind of returns they were used to.
When did usury become legal?
I would say that it happened slowly through the late 1960s and early 1970s. You know, there were at first very limited deregulations with lots of bells and whistles to make sure it wouldn't go too far. So if you look at the first state laws that deregulated usury, they usually say